The Banking Scene Director's Cut goes behind the scenes, sharing stories and insights to help you build the bank of tomorrow.
Welcome to this episode of the Banking Scene Director's Cut, where we have Wesley from SAS, who's going to be talking to us today all about Agentic AI. Welcome to the show, Wesley.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me here.
And I'm going to be diving straight in because we had a roundtable session last week where one of the first things that we questioned of all of the bankers was, what do they mean when they say agentic AI? And there actually wasn't any agreement around the table of what they were actually meaning with agentic. It was sort of a bit of a generative AI, some co-pilots in there, some assistants. And what do you find when banks say they want agentic AI? What problem are they actually trying to solve? And what do you think they are mislabeling as sort of conventional automation as agentic?
Well, I think, indeed, we kind of had the previous phase before agentic AI, which was more like traditional machine learning and then also decisioning. And I think from that there was kind of something missing. I think people felt that something was missing, and it's kind of what we call the decision execution gap. So you had all of these statistical models. They kind of came up with numbers, with probabilities, etc. But actually, there was no action after that. So that's one of the key things that in banking and in other industries people want to try to solve with agentic AI. So when that is talking about agentic AI, talking about agency, that's kind of the first thing that comes up in their mind. And then also kind of second part is to solve the cost to serve in operation-heavy functions like in KYC, investigations, complaints management, everything that is kind of document-heavy, etc. There we know that generative AI models are very good at. So that leans then into the fact that agentic AI can make that much more efficient. And then thirdly, of course, kind of the developer productivity. It's one of the key use cases with generative AI. But with agentic, we're also now kind of moving from not only kind of a question response thing, but more kind of automating that whole productivity environment for the developer, where you have real automated actions and not kind of only answers or pieces of code that get back to them. So these are kind of, I think, one of the three top things that agentic AI can solve. But if you talk really about definition, about language, what is now agentic AI and how and what are kind of the attributes of a real agentic system, then the first thing is called decomposition. So the system has to have a objective and will work to make that objective happen. Will carry out all of the tasks that fulfill that objective. That's one thing. The second thing is the planning is dynamic, and the planning is not fixed or written in hard-coded business rules. That is more what decisioning systems did, and that's where with agentic AI, we move from that to systems that can dynamically plan and that get kind of input that at the moment of when the input gets fed to the agentic system, decides how to treat that and which actions to carry out. That's a big difference with deterministic systems. Thirdly, with that, it has to have autonomy to select the right toolings that it had. So there is no predefined script given to the agent that it should select specifically this tool or that tool. It needs to have a certain autonomy. I think these are kind of the main attributes that I would say make an agentic system having agency and differ from previous systems.
Okay, so within that context, do you think that there are agentic AI use cases that are being a bit oversold at the moment? That's a bit of a loaded question for you as a technology provider, but do you think that when you look at the media hype around agentic systems, do you think that there's any that are being oversold where you're going, no, 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 that's not a good case to?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's well, kind of contrary to kind of the attributes that we give it. I do not believe right now that it can handle kind of fully end-to-end workflows. For example, KYC, for example. I think there is a lot of in that customer journey of KYC, a lot of things that can be automated, where agentic AI can help. But in the end, you have kind of the accountability that you as a bank don't want to give 100% away to an agentic system, because if it makes a mistake, then the repercussions are quite big and quite large, and you have the reputation risk, of course, as a bank. So yes, it can create a lot of automation, but I'm not a firm believer of kind of automating end-to-end without any human in the loop workflows. That's one thing. Second thing is also kind of the multi-agent systems. I think in the future, we will see more and more of these systems, but right now, I think they are oversold. Because it's already very hard to manage a single agent system. Yes, it works in a demo, but in a production environment where you really have to take decisions and carry out actions, also in a regulated environment, specifically for banking, it is very hard to make that bulletproof and to make it reliable for a single agent system, let alone for a swarm of agents that are interacting with each other.
I think maybe people are getting a bit ahead of themselves there when they it's the techies wanting to get excited about using all the latest possibilities. But I'm glad that you had brought up, things that work in demos but maybe don't work so well in production. What tends to actually slow down that implementation, or what kills pilots the fastest? Is it people run into a compliance hurdle or a data quality hurdle, or they suddenly discover they've got lack of governance? What is the first hurdles that people hit into when they're trying to move something from pilot into production or from their demo into production?
I think, well, the biggest thing is the data access, I would say, because if you run a pilot, you run it against a curated extract of data. But if you run it in production, then you have to deal with kind of data. The PII masking, for example, you have now the real-time freshness of the data. So the agent that worked in the development environment doesn't see the same data in a production environment, and that we know that agentic system already can that they by nature can hallucinate. But if then the data is really different as well, then that's kind of an accelerator to hallucination. Secondly is the integration or the integration depth with systems in production. I would say there are a lot of systems that, for example, have closed APIs or even do not have APIs, which make it very hard to kind of integrate all of them. And sometimes it is really needed to really get to the value, or to be able to for the agent to reach its objective. And then, of course, also kind of once it's to run it in production, you need to be able to audit it. You need to be able to see, okay, how did it reason? What were the tools that it used, etc. And that is not always very evident because you can't just ask the model to provide its reasoning, because then you're just asking the system that you want to audit itself to ask for its reasoning. So you have to build kind of deterministic logic in place to be able to identify what the reasoning of the system was. So these are kind of, I would say, the three biggest risks I would say, to go from pilot to production.
Now, you had mentioned earlier on still keeping a human in the loop. And one of the discussions that we've been having quite regularly is the question of accountability. How do you think banks should think about that accountability when an agent completes part of a workflow, but the human still owns the outcome? Because only a human can really be accountable. I mean, we were talking about this again at the roundtable when we said there's no negative consequence for an agent. It's a piece of code, whereas a human can get fired, could be defined, could be taken to court, could end up with a criminal record even maybe. So how should what are the key things that a bank will need to think of? What does meaningful human oversight look like?
I think even if an agent does and 80% of the work, that doesn't mean that the human's accountability is suddenly reduced with 80%. That's, I think, a big thing. It just changes the nature of what the human is accountable for. And that means that instead of being accountable for the decision, the human becomes accountable for kind of the conditions under which that the system was permitted on their behalf. In that way, I think it's important to kind of also build a kind of sort of decision rights envelope, or how do you want to call it, for the agent to behave. Kind of setting some boundaries, some boundaries of autonomy that the agentic system has and can't kind of move or act beyond it. So in terms of kind of what is meaningful. I think your next question was kind of what is meaningful oversight, right?
Yeah, and the reason for that question is it has been discussed with us, where people have said because of the speed at which agents can now complete what used to be manual processes, the role that the humans have to play is almost becoming a rubber stamping, because now where they would have been the ones the whole way through the process completing that manual work, an agent just simply says, here's an exception, you need to make a decision. And because of the volume of those decisions, the human is now just basically going, yes, 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 and putting their trust in the agent. And there's a concern that has been raised that that's just going to become a rubber stamping exercise. Have you had this experience yet? Has this been raised within the banks yet, that the humans are being overwhelmed with just being the last part of the process now?
Well, it depends on the use case. I mean, well, if you look, for example, at fraud management and fraud alerts, what you typically do there is you kind of let the agents route the cases that are kind of high risk to the user, and then the cases that are kind of low risk, maybe there give it some autonomy to say whether it's a false positive or a false negative, true positive, whatever. Let it make that decision itself by kind of upfront deciding what kind of the risk is for a certain transaction, and then really kind of let the human involve the human where the case is very risky or the case is very complex. And that way you don't overload the human, because you can't read everything. Maybe in certain use cases the scope is a little bit smaller, and there it is maybe possible. And if it is possible, or at least if the agent puts the human in the loop, it has to provide all of the context that it kind of used to make its decision or to make kind of the request for the human to make a decision on their behalf. So not just like, do you approve or do you not approve? No, give the whole, as much as possible, context to the human, which is very important.
Now, from your perspective as a services provider, system supplier, integrator, How do you advise banks on the sort of build versus buy in the agentic AI stack? Like, especially when they want differentiation, but they also need the speed, auditability, supportability. What parts should the bank retain the most control over? What parts are they able to get supplied out of the box by a provider? What architecture choices should they make? What's your strongest advice to a bank on that approach?
Well, I think, if you look at an agent, it's not, it consists of multiple layers. And so it's kind of a stack of multiple layers. And I think within that stack, for each layer, a bank can make a decision on, okay, this is something that I will outsource, and this is something buy, or this is something that I will build. And I think kind of what is becoming a commodity, and typically foundational models are becoming a commodity. Everybody has access to it. That is typically something that you would say, okay, we buy it. But anything outside of that, for example, encodes your decision logic, or encodes your policy rules, etc., your prompting, etc. These are the things that are very organizational specific, banking specific, the things where you can have an edge and you can have a differentiator compared to other banks. That is where I would say you need to build that. And you can have kind of frameworks from vendors that allows you to kind of build these prompts, and the routing logic and the policy enforcement, etc. All of these things that can guide you in building that, and still keep versioning and reversibility and all of these features. But at least the content of it should be built, I think, by themselves and not kind of bought off the shelf, because then you lose your edge. You get into troubles of accountability if things goes wrong, etc., etc.
And there's a bit of a gray area of who's accountable for what. If they're going to take something, is it the bank or is it the vendor? And yeah, that was another gray area. We won't go down to that one. But an interesting point was brought up recently, where somebody I was speaking to said an agent should be treated like a human and should be have the same way as you would have a review with a human and a performance report and measurements, that they need to operate at certain standards. And it was quite an interesting discussion when they went, no, you should treat an agent like you would any other staff member. But it was essentially a conversation around metrics and measurement. How do you measure the performance of an agent? How should banks go, this agent is performing better than a human would, or it's saving me X amount of time? Are there a standard set of statistics where people can go, this is a good implementation of an agent or something like that? Have you helped people do something like that around measuring the effectiveness of an agent?
Yes, but I think what there are good practices kind of in measuring agents kind of upfront before the deployment. Although it's still, I don't think it's still as matured or advanced as it was in measuring like statistical models. And therefore, we have our model risk management systems that are also widely described in regulatory frameworks on how to approach that and how to do that. Measuring agents, which are not just models, but they are kind of systems as a whole, it's much harder. But again, as I said, there are things to measure them, but often that's upfront. The hard part is also kind of to measure things at runtime. And then you have to decide, okay, what are then the most important things to measure? You can measure your uptime, but more importantly, you want to measure your accuracy. But okay, what is accuracy? That is kind of
measure the outcomes, right?
Yeah, you measure the outcomes, the quality of the outcome. So, that's something that that's always a difference, and that's something that I don't think you can buy it from the shelf either. That's something that you have to decide in the organization, and you have to measure it. And typically, you can measure it like, for example, judging answers by another LLM. That's a strategy, but again, as I pointed out, you're kind of using again a probabilistic system to measure a probabilistic answer. So there are also deterministic ways of measuring the quality of answers. These are typically the NLP techniques, more classical NLP techniques. But that is, I think, a very valuable way to measure answers, the quality of answers in a more statistical and factual way.
Deterministic approach to probabilistic answers.
Exactly.
I think that is a key soundbite out of this. Fantastic. Thank you very much for your insights today, Wesley. We have run out of time, so all I can do is thank you once again for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me, Andrew.